But first, is Doctor Who too scary? Some die-hard Doctor Who fans have accused the show of going too far after it introduced its most terrifying creature yet, a woman. I understand some Who fans also find the idea of a female Doctor not only frightening, but scientifically implausible.
Yes, but weirdly they were fine with episodes where the moon turned out to be a dragon egg, the Queen was a werewolf, and some other bullshit about dinosaurs on a spaceship.
Yes, very funny MASH reports. Remind me again what literary genius came up with dinosaurs on a spaceship? That didn't exactly bode well now, did it? And yes, critics may very well be tripping over themselves to celebrate the fact that everyone's favourite Time Lord has finally transitioned into a positive role model for transgender children the world over. But not everyone has fallen head over heels in love with the 13th Doctor. And so I thought I'd attempt to mansplain exactly why that might be.
This is gonna be fun.
So in the interest of full disclosure, I should begin by saying that I am a fully grown adult male and a lifelong fan of the long-running British sci-fi series Doctor Who. I'm also a committed champion of equality and human rights for all, and in recent years have taken to making YouTube videos which point a finger at some of the more glaring contradictions and double standards, often promoted by people pushing particularly progressive perspectives on matters of social justice, identity politics, and the potential perils and pitfalls of unregulated adult speech. And so, from the moment when the 13th Doctor was introduced to the world, it has been kind of inevitable that I would feel the need to take some time out of my busy schedule and share some thoughts about a certain timey-wimey, gendy-bendy matter of national importance that has helped to put food on the table for a not insignificant number of headline writers and opinion makers over the past 18 months. A common complaint about the show's new direction is that it has been culturally appropriated by so-called social justice warrior types who are more concerned with promoting their personal, political, ideological agendas and indoctrinating the youth of Britain than they are with spinning anything close to a half-decent yarn, all whilst slavishly adhering to backstage corporate diversity targets and perceived expectations about on-screen political correctness. Given the themes explored by this channel, I will be scrutinising the legitimacy of such complaints in a fair amount of detail, as well as sharing some thoughts, and most importantly, feelings, about Series 11's big bads, Lucky 13, Team TARDIS, the star-studded membership of the extended fam, and the sort of stories they have been summoned to tell. If you've seen my previous analysis of Star Wars The Last Jedi, then you'll have a fair idea about how this is going to go. There are plenty of predictable parallels between these two productions, but I also want to highlight one crucial difference that makes all the difference in the world if you're a fan of either of these two extremely lucrative franchises. I'll get to all that in a bit, But as the Doctor is a cultural icon, particularly close to my very singular human heart, I want to begin by stepping back in time and sharing my initial feelings about a casting announcement that has been described as the biggest development in this iconic series' 55-year plus history, and a game changer that will transform it forever. Believe it or not, my oldest ever childhood memory is the image of what I'm sure you will agree is this terrifying Tyrannosaurus stalking Sarah Jane Smith in early 1974. Soon after, Tom Baker became my doctor, and my doctor was very obviously a bloke, overcoming unimaginable evil, armed only with his brains, a screwdriver, and a magically manic, mischievous grin. He was a brilliant role model for my impressionable young mind, and I thank him to this day. But for the same reason, I do entirely empathise with Times columnist and famous feminist Caitlin Moran, who lamented the loss of a singular and vital role model for young boys, who she argued is the only superhero in Western culture who is a nerdy, gentle, amusing pacifist. And in an age where boys are drastically underperforming at every level of education and male suicide is reaching pandemic proportions, it does feel sad to witness such a gentle, intellectual and charismatic male role model being snatched away from impressionable young minds, especially in an era, genre and even specific television vehicle where strong female role models have hardly been in short supply. Ironically, one former doctor was viciously hounded off Twitter and pilloried in the press for saying pretty much exactly the same thing, but then such are the dangers of straying from the official party line in this brave new world.
Jamie Gillespie has added a lot of red angry faces. You've ruined it. You haven't even seen me do it yet. For each sexist bigot threatening not to watch, there'll be a young girl with a new hero they didn't have before. Hashtag good riddance. Hashtag Dr. 13. Sam, who is at, have a better name, Sam, on Twitter. I can't even say it. He said ruined. I hope we hang out sometime.
Technically speaking, the Doctor's transformation is entirely consistent with the established narrative and canon of the show, albeit thanks to some relatively recent retconning. And as Caitlin Moran also acknowledged in the same article, if you're a Doctor Who fan, you really had little choice but to embrace the new transition, because after all, that is exactly what the Doctor himself would do. Every single one of him. It is still, of course, entirely possible that our mould-breaking 13th Doctor will ultimately go down in history as the regeneration that well and truly reinvigorates the franchise for generations to come and extends its global reach. But the dawn of this apparently fresh new era did feel suspiciously a bit like stepping back in time. Fellow YouTuber Barrelstrack has done an excellent breakdown of the quite striking similarities between the colour years of classic Who from 1970 and how things have played out since Russell T Davies's reboot arrived in 2005. The ratings hits achieved by both Pertwee and Eccleston, followed by the unprecedented leap towards even greater popularity achieved by their respective successors, are just two of the more obvious parallels that he points out. Parallels that consistently carry through both respective timelines, all the way to the arrival of Sylvester McCoy. McCoy's appointment was made against a backdrop of controversy, bad feeling, and a steady ratings decline. And despite plenty of grumblings about the quality and tone of his predecessor's reign, his appointment was greeted with a high degree of uncertainty from the fan base. The moral panic over so-called video nasties had also pushed external pressures onto proceedings, which producers have acknowledged had a direct impact on the tone of Colin Baker's last adventures. This direction went into overdrive the following year with something of a pantomime feel for season 24, which was broadcast only a month after the notorious Hungerford Massacre and is considered by many as the worst year of classic era Who. Fast forward 30 years, and the apparent impact of insatiable demands from a new generation of identity-inspired moral guardians certainly invite comparisons to the final era of classic Doctor Who.
Yeah, so we're absolutely thrilled about the Doctor Who news, but also want to talk just a bit about the limits of victories like this. It needs to be said that Doctor Who is an overwhelmingly white show, and that issues of representation do not exist in isolation from each other. It's not as if you fix the woman problem, then race problem, then queer trans problem, etc. It all has to happen in tandem. Treating these as separate issues works to create a vision of progress and perpetuates the very imbalances we're struggling against. We need to acknowledge the way these issues are inextricably linked if we're going to move toward a more equitable world for everyone. But we can and should celebrate the hell out of this news because it's truly wonderful while also acknowledging where we still need to go. Doctor Who has always been a very inclusive show. I mean, the Doctor's last companion was a black lesbian.
There could be a fucking black Mexican Chinese demisexual lesbian feminist otherkin in a wheelchair with no legs and shit. And these crybabies would still not be happy.
Personally, I don't think season 11 was quite the irretrievable disaster that some people are making it out to be, but overall I would certainly place it a lot closer to that end of the scale than the fawning reviews from critics that somehow managed to win it the Golden Tomato for the best TV sci-fi of 2018. By now, it is fair to say that season 11 definitely has its haters, but conversely, it also clearly has its fans. And as with every era that has come before, the adventures of the 13th Doctor will inevitably become firm favourites, at least for some. If you've watched this far, then you've probably already made your own mind up about it. And it should go without saying that your feelings are just as valid and deserve just as much respect as anyone else's, including my own. That said, a fairly popular consensus is that the scripts were substandard, and the shift in tone and simplified storytelling made it feel more like a spin-off made for the BBC's children's television channel. As a fan, I gave up after 3 relatively painful weeks, in no small part because I was so unprepared for Jodie Whittaker's surprisingly erratic, sonic-wielding, putty-faced performances that I seriously started to wonder if I wasn't really a misogynistic dinosaur after all. My favourite show made me feel like I was the problem. And put simply, after 40 years, it simply stopped being fun. Ultimately, the biggest problem was clearly the quality of writing, but criticisms about a so-called PC agenda certainly do merit closer examination. Because, in my humble subjective opinion, season 11 may very well ultimately be remembered as offering an interesting insight into some of the perils and pitfalls of pandering to perceptions of political correctness, to the excessive extent that it overrides other crucial priorities, such as plots, performances, production values, and respecting diversity of thought from within your already commendably diverse and harmonious fan base. So with that thought in mind, let's now turn to the question of exactly how much respect for diversity this new PC-BBC friendly version of Doctor Who actually had.
More on this now. I'm joined by Kate Smurthwaite, who's a feminist comedian. She's in our central London studios. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. How important is it that for the first time this role has gone to a woman?
Well, it's brilliant, isn't it? It's absolutely kind of hilarious, actually, people going, well, of course, I can accept the fact that the Doctor travels through time in a TARDIS that's smaller outside than in and uses a sonic screwdriver to attack moving statues. But, oh my goodness, how could they possibly be played by a woman? Well, the simple answer is that it's always been in the script that when the Time Lord regenerates, changing gender has always been an option. There are other Time Lords in the series that have changed gender. It makes complete sense. And what's actually shocking is that it's been a guy for the last 12 iterations. The chances of that, you know, if you know how to toss a coin and count how it lands, are pretty low.
Doctor Who is by now something of a flagship show for the BBC, especially on the world stage, and it is no coincidence that it is Jodie Whittaker's face that beams back at us from the cover of their 2018 progress report on diversity and inclusion. Its new production team have also spoken proudly about their conscious bias towards achieving ambitious diversity targets in front of and behind the curtain. And as far as ticking those corporate diversity boxes, they've certainly managed to cover an impressive number of bases, particularly when it comes to the diverse spectrum of personal identity characteristics affording representation within the core team TARDIS alone. For starters, there is 50% representation for both female and minority ethnic characters. And on the age scale, it starts at 19 and ends with a retired bus driver and an ancient alien who's adopted the appearance of a middle-aged white middle-class mum. We also have regional accents, one practicing Muslim, 2 people with a disability, and 3 from a lower socio-economic background. And based on various clues of varying degrees of subtlety, not only does our transgender doctor now identify as gender non-binary, but they are also almost certainly gay, or bisexual at the very least. Now that's a commendable amount of boxes ticked before we even extend the scope towards the noted and much celebrated diversity of the Doctor's so-called extended fam, who were proudly paraded in a bizarre and poorly pitched season-long teaser at the end of episode 1. A pitch, by the way, which appeared to be aimed more at mums and corporate bean counters, much more so than an attempt to entice a new generation of kids to stick around for the rest of the ride. By the time Jos the Pregnant Man turned up in episode 5, I was beginning to imagine how the whole thing could be livened up for future audiences with a game of diversity-themed bingo. Initiatives to promote equality of opportunity are clearly to be commended, and consequently attempts to convey constructive criticism often tend to just simply get shot down, or ignored, or worse still, critics run the risk of being called out as a bigot and finding themselves the target of a deeply unpleasant public shaming dogpile. Just ask Jamie Gillespie or Peter Davidson. But aside from potentially pulling the audience out of the story, productions that pursue heavy-handed agendas do have a tendency to invite criticism from spokespersons of the very social identity groupings that they are proactively trying to make feel more embraced. By way of example, Whittaker's first run has already garnered flack from the LGBTQ community for indulging in the cliched bury your gays trope, after people noticed that no less than 3 gay, lesbian or bisexual characters were killed off almost as soon as they had been introduced. Of course, if you look through any one particular lens in splendid isolation, it will tend to be possible to pick out patterns that reinforce any particular preferred perspective, even if that pattern really isn't there or isn't intended to mean what you think it does. So before I add a few genuine observations of my own, let me offer a note of caution regarding anyone's personal problematic perspective of any particular programme, and that obviously includes my own. And to do that most effectively, I want to propose the possibility that the Doctor is a white supremacist, even though she clearly isn't. Or is she? Because after all, for over half a century local time, she has been travelling through the vortex in almost exclusively Caucasian company. And lest we forget, all, count them, 19 of her currently known former or future faces have rather noticeably all been exclusively white. A fact which, as Cambridge mathematics graduate Kate Smurthwaite alluded to earlier, is something of a statistically significant anomaly, to say the very least. But it's when we get down to the actual nitty-gritty of personal preference arguments regarding persons for the purpose of possible procreation that we can really start to join the dots. Because since her return to our screens in 2005, the Doctor has adventured in a parallel universe where interracial intimate relations are very much the norm, certainly when compared to our own contemporary reality, where they account for less than 8% of current UK unions. And in this context, every single time that the Doctor dances, her dalliances have noticeably been out of step with practically everybody else. Indeed, every single one of her contemporary travelling companions with a romantic backstory has been seen to have participated in interracial relations, and yet the Doctor's busy dance card has always been exclusively white. A track record that dates back to her very first screen kiss in the 1990s, and all the way back to the 1960s if Susan Foreman's heritage is to be believed. And as things have hotted up in the naughty naughties, all four of her on-screen wives, all of her most notable lovers, and of course her beautiful blue-eyed blonde daughter have indisputably all been exclusively white. In other words, whilst the Doctor clearly isn't a white supremacist, thanks in no small part to an element of PC pandering, it is entirely possible to present a relatively compelling argument as to why she almost definitely is. So please do bear that clearly imperfect thought in mind, as I now proceed to point out a few problematic perspectives of my own that potentially undermine some of the lip service and chatter about inclusion, equality, and respect for diversity. Let's start with the bury your gays trope, which is, let's face it, hardly the most convincing evidence that Doctor Who has suddenly decided to go all homophobic. As I've already mentioned, yellow journalists love nothing better than to stir the pot with such perceived microaggressions, but in fairness to the LGBTQ community, given the various pre-season hints about representation from across the rainbow spectrum, and Chibnall's own proclamation that his gender non-binary Doctor should be a unifying figure for that specific community, I can understand why some from that demographic might have been left feeling more than a little underwhelmed by their on-screen portrayal to date. Any notion of romance has been a notable casualty of the newly neutered narrative, and when you combine that with corporate targets for the on-screen portrayal of people with varying sexual orientations, it's not exactly hard to see how they ended up with so many clunky references to marital or partner status, not to mention that supremely stereotypically camp portrayal of King James I. Of course, it is possible that Teen TARDIS's one apparently practicing Muslim may also turn out to be a member of the Rainbow Team. But by season's end, the companion with arguably the most intersectional identity in the entire history of Who was also sadly in the running to be remembered as one of its most one-dimensional. Personally, I do think Chris Chibnall deserves some kudos for casting the first ever Asian character in a central role, especially in the context of the ethnic mix of the country the show is apparently supposed to reflect. But aside from paving the way for adventures involving 3 generations of her family, and conveniently helping to tick a fair few crucial casting boxes along the way, you have to wonder what's the point, because practically the one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that Mandeep Gill was given bugger all else to do.
I'd like to think I didn't get cast just because I was Asian. There were certain stories that it lended itself to, but I hopefully got cast because I could do the job, and then I happened to be brown. So, you know, secondly, I was brown, and we can then explore that. Yeah.
The first female-led TARDIS also happens to be its biggest, at least since they killed off Adric back in 1982, and it hasn't gone unnoticed that it is a woman of colour who's been most poorly served by season 11 scripts. And while this may very well be remembered as the most woke ever rendition of a 50-year-old sci-fi staple, others have already begun to unpick some problems with the portrayal of women in general, including the newly transitioned star of the show. People like the assistant editor of The New Statesman, who asked the question, why isn't Jodie Whittaker's Doctor Who the lead character in her own damn show? And concludes that the latest in a long line of white male showrunners is simply more interested in writing for male characters. And in fairness, he kind of does seem to have a point. Indeed, the very first episode, features an example of something feminist critics colloquially call fridging, which occurs when a female character is killed off to drive the narrative and help the audience to relate to the man who most feels her loss. A black woman and a white man, respectively, if we're going to get particularly pernickety about such things. And while hardly the most engaging in the show's long history, the two people to experience any sort of meaningful arc also both coincidentally just so happen to be blokes. Granted, this may not be a particular surprise to regular viewers because it is almost always the companions who drive the narrative forward, but looking back over 11 episodes as one greater whole, it has been interesting to observe that more often than not it is a male protagonist who ends up having the most significant or meaningful journey. I'll expand on that thought in a moment, but I just want to flag my biggest problem with a sometimes supremely shallow effort to be everything to everyone all of the time. Making Ryan's struggle with dyspraxia the central focus of the opening scene of the very first episode was certainly a bold move, and one I think the cast largely managed to pull off. Critics praised them for raising awareness of a little-known development disorder affecting hand-to-eye coordination, and Chibnall was particularly commended for the grounded and thoughtful conclusion to that episode, where we see that Ryan's disability isn't just suddenly magically cured by the arrival of a mysterious and somewhat supernatural doctor. Even if she can personally brush off the sort of physical trauma that's previously done for the likes of the legendary Tom Baker. Mind you, in the very next episode he did noticeably manage to shoot 3 robot sentries with pretty much pinpoint accuracy while weaving in between them at quite a pace. So there is that. If only there had been a character with firearms training available to take his place, I guess. But cynicism aside, Ryan's personal struggle was undoubtedly one of the strongest and most memorable elements of what was a fairly serviceable 3-star series opener. And I don't want to piss on Chibnall's chips too harshly, because the Dyspraxia Foundation were delighted with the exposure, and everyone's personal experience of disability is entirely unique. That said, the main point I want to make is that Season 11 looked a lot more inclusive towards people with disability at the start of October than it did by New Year's Day. Chibnall's production team will have been working to the BBC's corporate diversity guidelines, which set out targets across the 4 main identity characteristics we've discussed. And one of the first things that strikes me was that while sex, race and sexual orientation targets all closely mirror UK demographics, their target for on-screen representation of disabled people is more than 50% lower than the estimated number of people of working age to have a disability in the UK today. And significantly, when it comes to on-screen and on-air representation, according to the most recent Diversity Progress report, we find that the goal of 8% representation of people with an incredibly broad spectrum of disabilities are the one ground where the BBC are currently failing to at least meet their targets, or even exceed it by almost 50% in the case of race. If you factor in Graham's cancer, then technically speaking at least 50% of Team TARDIS can be recognised as disabled for the purposes of the Disability Discrimination Act at the very least. And it's certainly possible that one or both conditions may impact on future plot lines, but I for one can't recall as much of a mention of either after episode 2, nor do I recall any evidence of representation within the wider extended fam. It's not necessarily fair to expect a writer of popular science fiction to find a way to portray the impact of welfare cuts that the United Nations recently described as a human catastrophe for disabled people in the UK, but they did find time to have a dig at working conditions in the shop that sells most of their merchandise. So then again, maybe it is. And it certainly sets Jodie's reassurances about the equitable size of her massive pay packet into something of a wider context. Personally, I think last season offered better examples of how disability can be integrated seamlessly into the narrative. But again, my intention is not to be unduly harsh, because the main point I'm trying to convey here is that the challenges faced by many of the most vulnerable people in a society the BBC are determined to reflect do very often end up being overshadowed by significant others when it comes to a rainbow coalition that's supposed to raise the tide for everybody's boat, with the obvious exception of straight white men. Which brings me to the Doctor's relatively new political perspective.
So it's pretty exciting that we're finally there. It's kind of a relief. We're also looking at a character who fights injustice, never puts their own needs first, always looks after others, only resorts to violence as a very last resort. It sounds like every feminist I know. I think it's about time that we had the Doctor played by exactly that.
From the Daleks to the Weeping Angels, Who fans are used to scary aliens. But for some male devotees, their ultimate fear is the vagina.
Long live the vagina and death to the penis.
I do see you, BBC. I see you. It's kind of hard to fool anybody that this isn't for the political agenda going on. And I believe that women should be given equal and men should be allowed the same things that women are and all that. But the Doctor... Are they doing this for the story or are they doing this for the political narrative?
I shouldn't feel bad because I wanted there to be a young, handsome Doctor, should I? Is that a bad thing?
It's so trendy nowadays to be offended and to be feminist and to be this and that, and if you want to do that, fine, you do you, but...
It's all just... It's getting to the point where I'm just sick of hearing all of this debate on gender and diversity. It just doesn't... I feel like it won't feel like the Doctor if it's not... if it's not the Doctor, but I'm sure I'll get used to it. It's fine.
People feel inferior and they want to feel more, but they want to feel more, they want to feel like better than other people at the same time, and I think that's just, I don't know, I don't think that's the right way to do things, but whatever.
They're just coming in like, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this. This character doesn't look like me. She's not frumpy and below average. It makes me insecure. Change it. Change this. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't even play that, but I don't like it. When it comes down to it, you wouldn't make Sherlock Holmes a female. You wouldn't make James Bond Jennifer Bond. So why are you making the Doctor female?
The story of a female incarnation of our favourite Time Lord was always going to be an interesting one to tell. And so consequently, the biggest disappointment after all the fuss is that Who's newly woke writer's room went out of their way not to tell it. If all the off-screen noise about the significance of this literal skylight-shattering sex change wasn't enough to convince you that 13 is indeed our first fully-fledged feminist Doctor, any remaining doubts must have been assuaged by season end, by which time, with the exception of one quick medieval dunking, the message had consistently been that a white woman is entirely capable of doing anything 13 men can do in pretty much exactly the same way. Some critics have suggested that, to date, this particular woman has largely presented a per man's carbon copy of David Tennant's greatest hits. But even those who have championed Jodie Whittaker's take on the Doctor acknowledge or even celebrate the facts that her gender has almost entirely been ignored. Showrunner Chris Chibnall proudly noted that such was the secrecy about Whittaker's appointment that his 5 co-writers for season 11 prepared scripts for a male Doctor, and yet because apparently the Doctor has never been defined by being either male or female, practically nothing needed to change. Now, such a notion may be fair enough as far as it's fair enough, but as well as acting as overall showrunner, Chibnall also delivered the lion's share of scripts, which makes his entirely conscious decision to write the Doctor as almost entirely gender neutral feel much more like a deliberate statement of political intent. Either that or the whole thing was just a bit of stunt casting to try and boost the flagging ratings, and the New Statesman is right, that he really can't write women. But when you consider the BBC's own current corporate context and wider cultural and political trends, Whittaker's casting and portrayal of a very British Time Lord does feel very much like the capitulation of a particular commercial franchise to external ideological demands. And while I wasn't being remotely serious about the Doctor being a white supremacist, the 13th Doctor is clearly a fully blown feminist, and quite possibly a so-called white feminist at that. For the uninitiated, a white feminist is a relatively pejorative term which describes a strand of 21st century feminism which almost exclusively focuses on the perspective and experiences of white middle-class women living a comparatively privileged life within the Western world. Multi-millionaire millennial Emma Watson complaining to the United Nations that her parents used to describe her as bossy is a pretty good example of white feminism. Bear in mind, this is the same Emma Watson who was plucked out of obscurity at the age of 8 to play Harry Potter's bossy classmate, and then earned a pretty penny promoting skin whitening products exclusively to the Asian market. And as likeable and enthusiastic as Jodie Whittaker very genuinely does appear to be, her interviews have offered an insight into a peculiar perspective from a Doctor whose very first act was famously to self-identify as feminist above and before any other aspect of self.
But what is wonderful is this realisation that a woman can be a doctor. And, you know, I may be playing an alien with 2 hearts, but I am qualified even though I'm a woman. that's always the bit.
Born in 1982, Whittaker has acknowledged having a pretty privileged childhood in a stable upper middle class family. Her dad, CEO of a local company, bought her a round the world plane ticket for her gap year when she turned 18. So not exactly J.K. Rowling's rags to riches backstory, to say the least. And yet, judging by some of the personal recollections she's shared in interviews, you'd be forgiven for thinking that she'd arrived from an entirely different time. Take this example in the run-up to her debut. When I was growing up, all of my heroes on TV and film, the parts I wanted to be doing, were not the ones that looked like me. They were on the sidelines, the girls who were clapping at the side and waving at the boys, who were doing all the fun bits of action and having the heroic moments. Or this comment, offered after her entire season had aired. When I was growing up, it was the white guys running about saving the day and doing really cool stuff. And as a girl, you were lucky if you just sat at the side and clapped. To be in the moment of change for that is incredibly exciting. Now, contrast such claims with the fact that Whittaker would have been 16 when Buffy the Vampire Slayer became a global smash, and as well as setting the template for Russell T Davis's Doctor Who reboot, went on to inspire an entire genre of shows about strong young women coming to terms with some sort of supernatural destiny while trying to maintain a normal life. And incidentally, the same year that Buffy arrived also saw Uma Thurman reprising the role of an action hero that Diana Rigg first made famous in the 1960s, and is not to be confused with Joanna Lumley's high-kicking turn in a similar role in the 1970s sequel. Those 2 facts alone do rather call Jodie's perspective into question, because fantasy and science fiction productions particularly have a long proud history of strong empowering females in central roles. Roles which include 2011's Attack the Block and 1,000 Kisses Deep, both played by none other than Jodie Whittaker. And lest we forget, the show she's inherited has featured its fair share of iconic and celebrated females over the decades.
Oh, mercy! You better submit, you know! Mercy! Help! Do you submit? I submit!
Small human female sighted on level 3.
What are you calling small?
Under a tree! Under a tree!
Indeed, a crucial ingredient of its successful reboot has been compelling storytelling driven almost entirely from the perspective of a by now fairly long line of strong, smart, independent women whose interactions with a somewhat mysterious and not altogether unhandsome stranger has managed to generate an extremely large female fan base for the show. The Sarah Jane adventures and Torchwood's Agent Cooper may have come and gone, but New Who writers should also be commended for laying the foundations for a whole heap of potential female-fronted spin-offs. From Rose Tyler, Earth Defender, to The Doctor's Daughter, and The Diary of River's Song. Not forgetting the Paternoster Gang Investigates, or Me and Clara's, or Bill and Heather's Long Way Round. There have been plenty of avenues to explore, and plenty of stories that are even possibly being told right now, in an alternative universe where opinioned opinionators are less preoccupied with the very significant symbolism of replacing the leading man. Meanwhile, regrettably, we're still stuck in the reality where our Doctor's once entirely egalitarian perspective has somewhat narrowed to accommodate a more exclusive way of looking at the world.
Equality isn't just about pushing someone forward, it's also about pushing some people back.
Yes.
Take a step backwards.
The Fawcett Society estimate that between 7 and 9% of the British population identify as feminist. So in representational terms, I guess you could argue that a feminist doctor is just about overdue. And it's entirely understandable how anyone looking in from the outside might feel it's well past time that a woman got the keys to the TARDIS and a pretty boy to boss about to boot. But most people with even a passing interest in the show's history understand that things are a tad more nuanced than some seasoned political players might like us to think. I certainly would have expected a member of the Liverpool branch of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society to show a bit more respect. Not because he cast a woman, which is entirely his prerogative, but he has rather leaned into the implied symbolism of a female Doctor, and in his capacity as showrunner, presumably signed off on the less than subtle marketing strategy, which invites us all to reimagine the show's long proud heritage as being somehow problematically patriarchal, heteronormative, and maybe even a bit racist. And as for that teaser trailer with the imploding glass ceiling, it may have been entirely in step with the BBC's current corporate message, but boy did it look, and most especially feel, extremely cheap indeed. Of course, it's easy to look back at over 5 decades of television history and find examples that fit with any particular narrative you might care to push. But in truth, Doctor Who has always been an extremely inclusive show for all the family, with egalitarian values written into its very DNA. On the one hand, it is possible to argue that egalitarianism and feminism basically mean the same thing, but then again, only one of these two political perspectives has for some reason been subjected to repeated stereotypical suggestions that they secretly hate half the human race. And to be fair, viewers already had a few legitimate reasons to wonder what sort of treatment boys might get when they reached the 13th hour.
Med team to sector 52, extraction chamber 7, regeneration in progress. Are you alright, sir? Sorry, ma'am.
Back to normal, am I? The only time I've been a man, that last body. Dear Lord, how do you cope with all that ego?
How do you defend that line? Back to normal. That's not okay. You can't say, oh, now that she's a woman, now that's normal, is it? No, sorry. And how do you cope with all that ego? That's just blatant sexism. And, you know, people say to me, oh, why are you not excited for a female Doctor? Because if shitty lines like that get into the new series, it's really going to just mess up the show. You can't say stuff like that, because if you flip the situation and it was a female Time Lord regenerating into a man, you couldn't have that. So why is it okay this way round? Back to normal. No. No, it's not back to normal. Man, woman, gay, straight, whatever. It's all normal.
The announcement that 58-year-old Bradley Walsh had signed on as a companion certainly raised a few eyebrows. But thankfully, Chibnall has steered clear of a predictable pale, stale male portrayal. The Doctor did let Graham take the rap for the whole Rosa Parks seeding incident, I suppose, but in general, it's been the male companions who've got in touch with their emotions and have been given the most sympathetic stories to tell. To an extent, this does have to be commended, especially in an era where masculinity is supposedly in crisis and under attack. But while some have gone as far as suggesting that this is actually evidence of Chibnall's own problematically patriarchal perspective, I propose that it has more to do with something I like to call the feminist gaze. Interestingly, some online observers have suggested that the disposable male trope has been a reoccurring feature throughout the season, and while it can be very easy to read too much into such matters, I can confirm that at least 4 times as many men did end up meeting their maker over the 11 episodes. But while I haven't had the benefit of the BBC's compulsory unconscious bias training, I suspect this trend is more an outcome of the Beeb's conscious emphasis on diversity casting than it is necessarily a deliberate nod to the kill all men hashtag. That said, when you factor in a few other variables, a still problematic picture can more seriously be proposed. Chibnall may have thrown Buffy out with the bathwater, in the sense of building towards a finale featuring this season's big bad, unless you're counting Tim the Tooth Monster, of course. Thematically, one of fourth wave feminism's biggest bogeymen is a noticeably reoccurring trope. And for the benefit of anyone too young to shave, I'm talking explicitly about a gender stereotype called toxic masculinity. If you're unfamiliar with the term, I'll leave some links in the low bar, but basically it is a sociological theory that some stereotypically male traits like competitiveness and stoicism can be harmful to themselves and to others. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it is interesting to note that the flip side of the sympathetic portrayals of men running throughout the series is the sort of stories they were being used to tell. That and the fact that all the baddies were male, obviously. For example, Carl was essentially episode's one archetypal damsel in distress, and obviously also a bit of a dick. As was Epso with his mummy issues, but another bit of damsel danger helped to teach him a valuable lesson about how to trust. Yaz's dad is presented as a house husband whose cooking just happens to be a little bit naff. And I'll spare the subtext of episode 5's pregnant man, but did you notice that the hunky male nurse's decision not to follow his doctor's orders didn't exactly turn out well? I could go on, but when you factor in Ryan and Graham's touchy-feely story arc, clearly one of the most consistent dynamics throughout the series is the portrayal of flawed and fragile men in subordinate positions to strong, authoritative women. And I exaggerate slightly when it comes to all the baddies being men, but only just as you're about to see. For starters, over the 11 episode run, I count 7 where that assertion holds entirely true. Episodes 2, 3, 4 and 7 are self-explanatory, and Tim the Stanza Warrior makes another 2. And while episode 6 has a bit of bait and switch involving 2 women in prosthetics, the real demons of the Punjab are also definitely blokes. Despite extremely aggressive behavioural traits and being toxic to the touch, I'm prepared to concede that the jury's still out when it comes to the pating. But that said, even in the 3 remaining episodes where things get a bit more grey, it's still possible to present a fairly convincing argument that the big bad is most definitely male. The Queen Morax could easily be mistaken for the main villain of the feminist favourites Witchfinders. But then again, this is the feminist favourite Witchfinders we're talking about, so technically speaking, she was simply serving under a patriarchal hierarchy, and so the big bad boy Buck ultimately stops with her stated lord and master, the King Morax. Episode 9's Solatract is portrayed exclusively as a female presence, but it is essentially just trying to be a friendly universe, whereas Daddy's parental priorities are at least a little problematic, and besides Ribbons is an utter bastard. And last but not least, we have a New Year special which sort of gave us plenty of white male extermination action at the hands of a female Dalek. But then again, What's-Your-Face was clearly a member of the extended fam who eventually exhibits the strength and fortitude to break free from the psychic tentacles of a literal space Nazi, who is as always played by a man. Personally, my masculinity isn't so fragile as to especially give a monkeys, but for a production so consciously concerned with equitable on-screen portrayal, it did consistently seem to offer a very particular and extremely gendered perspective of our world, which brings me to our New Year resolution. Hilariously, the New Year's special succeeded in encapsulating the overall white feminist feel of the season as a whole. It begins with a white male on white male murder involving a white male who turns out to be the weak link in an ancient plot to protect the Earth. The central narrative is driven by characters played by two middle-class white women, ably supported by a predominantly black and minority ethnic extended fam, and includes a deadbeat dad redemption arc and the requisite hint of interracial romance. Any pre-established hidden disabilities remain entirely out of view, and every single to show his face is immediately exterminated, including one token gay. Meanwhile, this episode's big bad involved an ideological supremacist parasite attempting to achieve world domination by attaching itself to an innocent host, manipulating it exclusively for its own megalomaniac purposes, for ultimately transforming into a flaming trash can and spreading fear and misery throughout the land. Where have I heard that before? But the most revealing moment of the entire series came when the Doctor called for reinforcements, and that by now infamous anti-Brexit joke. At time of broadcast, the UK was literally weeks away from exiting the European Union, after over 2 years of acrimonious and divisive debate between those for and against that very outcome. And the context of Chibnall's clunky joke with a jig was that it very clearly took a side. To be honest, it wouldn't really have mattered which side it was, but predictably, not only did it essentially stick a middle finger up to the majority of people who participated in the largest vote in British history, but the joke about funding withdrawal by international partners, leaving the UK defenceless, had echoes of the so-called Project Fear narrative that the Europhile political establishment have been accused of peddling in an attempt to sway the general public. And as such, it stood in sharp contrast to a similarly politically charged joke in New Who's very first season, where a joke about weapons of mass destruction is very much made at the expense of a political elite portrayed as aliens attempting to exploit the British people and literally getting high on their own farts. So, all in all, Team TARDIS may not have quite matched the lows of season 24, but then again, they haven't exactly been at the helm of the best ever publicly funded advert for inclusion and respect for diversity either, now have they?
Oops. What's that look upon your face? No, this is not the good old days. What did we do to you to deserve this? You're doing everything you can to preserve this. Let's all pretend to tell the truth. Above all, I hope I've been of use.
It's going to be shit. I'm officially done. Bye, Doctor Who. Alright. Rude.
What's that look upon your face? No, this is not the good old days. What did we do to you to deserve this? You're doing everything in your power to preserve this. Let's all pretend to tell the truth. Above all, well, I hope I've been of use.
I've got a choice. Stay at home with my mum, my boyfriend, my job, or chuck it all in for danger and monsters and life or death. What do you think?
Doctor Who, Saturday at 7 on BBC One.
The decades that have taken us to the Doctor's latest regeneration haven't, to say the least, always been especially smooth. And it is worthwhile remembering that Doctor Who would have probably been long since retired to the archives of television history if Christopher Eccleston's unlikely casting had ended up going a different way. The night before its broadcast back in 2005, one of the BBC's own regular opinionators famously dismissed Russell T Davis's lovingly crafted reimagining as cheap, muddled storytelling and confused about who it wanted its audience to be.
The thing looks really cheap. I mean, you've got to put money up there, otherwise it just does not work. The stuff, the toys don't work, the stories are all over the place. Who is this for? Is it for my generation? Is it for 40-somethings? Is it for babies? What is it for? They haven't made up their mind who they're talking to. That's the big problem for me. Also, I just really don't know what's going on. You need to know what's happening in this. The acting is wonderful, the writing is wonderful, but it looks thin. It just looks cheap. And this kind of thing you can't do that with. You just can't.
Fortunately, not everyone agreed, but back then the BBC had considered the revival to be something of a gamble, and having only secured their leading man on a one-year contract, much of the optimism generated by his critically lauded debut was severely undermined 4 days later by the news that he'd already decided to quit. And yet, despite such a timely setback, Eccleston's one-year era went on to bag the coveted BAFTA for Best TV Drama, and over 10 million tuned in for the hastily commissioned Christmas special, which saw David Tennant secure a long and fruitful future for the show. A fact which underlines that crucial distinction between the current New Who dilemma and the place where Star Wars fans found themselves at the end of 2017.
For 2 years, you're like, holy fuck, what's gonna happen? What's he gonna do? What's he gonna say? Is he gonna be like, oh my god, you're my daughter? Oh my god, my lightsaber? Like, what's gonna happen?
Fucking gives him the... Fucking hell. Gives him the light, says, you know, fucking hurt my head. Ah, fuck.
Because for generations of fans enthralled by the original 1970s Star Wars trilogy, Rian Johnson's excruciating subversion of their expectations also irrevocably scuppered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get the original band back together, a travesty which made the supposedly misogynistic backlash all the more understandable. By contrast, and to an extent entirely against the odds, young and old Who fans alike have been rocking out together in relative harmony for well over a decade, and while there have undoubtedly been personal peaks and troughs, it was inevitable that at some point there had to be a major fork in the road, which is not to remotely ring the death knell for the Doctor. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, speaking as someone lucky enough to have witnessed several halcyon periods for the show, it is comforting to know that we do now have 50 years of adventures in time and space to fall back on in hard times. Besides, personally, I would have bitten your hand off back in 2005 if you'd promised me over a decade of adventures taking in all of my Doctor's remaining regenerations, and even culminating with a sentimental seasonal callback to where it all began. And maybe Team TARDIS will be successful recruiting sergeants for the next generation of young Whovians. But if 13's reign really does end up mirroring a path mapped out in the 1980s, then anyone deciding to stick around may at the very least be rewarded with a final flush of half-decent stories, while the ratings complete a death spiral and the entire thing is quietly shelved, at least for a while. At least back then, the Beeb were actively trying to kill the show. This time around, it feels more like they're trying to kill off its existing audience. And the saddest, most unforgivable, and I guess most ironic outcome arising from Doctor Who's clumsy and heavy-handed push into so-called progressive politics as being the toxic and markedly unharmonious environment that it has created for fans. A toxic environment that is unlikely to improve anytime soon, no matter which direction they decide to go next. I mean, it's not like they can magically turn the Doctor back to normal now, is it? Imagine how that would go down.
Doctor Who is definitely more than just a TV show to people, but when you boil it down, this is just a television program. This is just supposed to entertain people, tell stories, and people are just supposed to watch and have debates. Now, when I mean debates, I don't mean the vitriol and the just horrible fucking nature of people that has just boiled to the surface as of late. Back in the day, it used to be stuff like, who's the best master, Delgado or Ainley? Who's the best Davros? Is it Terry Malloy or is it Michael Wisher? Who would actually win in a fight? Is it the Daleks or is it the Cybermen? Nah, that ain't happening anymore, is it?
This is the death of intelligence. This is the death of intelligence.
I don't want to be part of a community or a fandom that is just an embarrassment. It's honestly an embarrassment. Like, obviously when The Last Jedi came out, that was a very divisive film to people, and a lot of people would have said then that the Star Wars fan base was incredibly toxic. Just totally and utterly awful. I genuinely think that Doctor Who is worse now than that Star Wars fandom ever was. Don't even get it twisted that it's just a thing with the fans. The BBC and the people involved with Doctor Who and people writing articles for The Independent or the Radio Times or whoever, they're not fucking helping. If anything, they're not only lighting the flames, but they're fanning them as well. People put out their opinion and they are just viciously attacked, personally attacked, and I cannot fucking stand for that whatsoever. Because on the one hand, we've got people who don't like this series, which they have every right not to, and they just label everybody who does like it as an SJW, an NPC. And you know what? Yeah, some people might be, but on the whole, some people just genuinely like this series of Doctor Who. But then you have people on the other side who, you know, see this series of Doctor Who and think, well, I like it, therefore anybody who doesn't like it must be a misogynist. I'm sorry, but that's absolute horseshit. And the thing that really irritates me is the fact that there are people out there who really wanted to like this series, but don't. And those people are still being labelled as misogynists and bigots and sexists and whatever ism or whatever it is you want to call them.
This is the gift